many people already familiar with your work and with all the awards that you've got, but would you mind introducing yourself and to those people who are not so familiar?
Sure. I never know exactly how to present myself because I've had so many different roles in my life, but I am very deeply interested in food and food history. But my paying career for 34 years, I was a professor of Russian literature at Williams College in Massachusetts. And at the end of my time there, I was teaching food studies in the sociology department. So I was able to channel my interest in food into my academic life. And I have written 8 cookbooks and founded a journal about food and culture called Gastronomica. I consulted for the Council of Europe on ways to promote food as a tool for tolerance and diversity. We all know how successful that has been, but it's still a very idealistic goal to reach towards. So I've worked in many different aspects of the academic and the culinary fields.
Speaking about your book, Beyond the North Wind, it's not strictly a fermentation book, but fermentation is deeply woven into the cuisine you explore in the book. What drew you to this region's food traditions, and why do you think it's important to write about it?
That's such a good question, because my very first cookbook, which I published in 1983, was a Russian cookbook. And it was really the dissertation I wanted to write and was not allowed to write on food and Russian literature. So it was drawing on more aristocratic Russian traditions, the overlay of French cuisine on Russian food. And the more time I spent exploring that part of the world, the more I realized that I hadn't actually written about Russian food at all. You know, it was about all the influences that came into Russia. And I wanted to get to something essential, the food that people in the far north had been eating for thousands of years, and how did they survive? We all have this image of cold places as being very inhospitable, which in a certain way they are, but not having any culinary riches. And what I discovered was that, especially if you have a place that isn't like the Mediterranean, that you just stick a plant in the ground and then you have all these beautiful fruits and vegetables that grow because of the sun and the gorgeous soil, there's an ingenuity that's really important. It's like you start with straw and you turn it into culinary gold. And I found that it's an amazingly, if not varied, then very flavorful and rich diet using foraged foods, mushrooms, incredible berries, wild honey, fish and other seafood from the sea, using herbs. And of course, they are so flavorful in the summertime when they have the midnight sun. They're just extraordinary because they're getting so much energy from the sun. And it got me thinking too about, well, what do you do when you have such a short growing season? You only have 3 months. You have to preserve that food. And that's where I think the genius of the northern way of life comes into being, is in the methods of preservation. And certainly in Russia, fermentation is, I'd say, after freezing, foremost among them. And so that got me moving in that direction, and something that I really want to share with other people.
All right. And your research also, I think, covers both Eastern European and Nordic food traditions. And what do you think are some of the most fascinating similarities or differences you've come across in this region's approach to fermentation?
Yeah, that's interesting too, because when I came up with the idea for the book that became Beyond the North Wind, what I actually wanted to do was something very different. I had published a cookbook on Nordic food in, I think it was 2015, called Fire and Ice, Classic Nordic Cooking. And I looked at 4 countries that I had actually lived in. I studied in Finland, I studied in Sweden. I did a lot of work for the Cultural Council in Norway, and I spent quite a bit of time in Denmark. So it was those 4 countries. But I decided I wanted to write about the North writ large, and I wanted to travel from the Far East in Russia all the way to the West through those classic Scandinavian countries into the Faroe Islands and Greenland and Iceland. And I was super excited about it. And my editor said, no one wants, recipes from the Faroe Islands and Greenland. They're too strange for Americans. And it made me really sad that it was so narrow-minded, but she wanted me to focus on Russia. So I thought, okay, I will. But in working up that proposal, the interesting thing I found was that the farther west you go, the sweeter foods become. There's a greater desire for sweet tastes. So one of the hallmarks of Russian and also Eastern European cooking is this absolute love for the sour. Like if you don't have foods that, and as I say this, I already feel that when I say the word sour, it's like I'm starting to salivate just thinking about sour things. If you don't have that flavor in a certain way, you don't feel like you've eaten healthily. If you look again at what I like to call the secular Russian trinity, which of course starts with vodka, and then you have sourdough black bread, and then you have lacto-fermented cucumbers, pickles. All 3 of those foods undergo fermentation before you get to the final product. And that is sort of what everything starts with. And so when you look at the breads in Russia, the sourdough has a really beautifully sour flavor. And it comes from a dark rye, which you don't find so much the further east you go. Well, I mean, you can find it in pumpernickels, but the actual rye bread tends to be of a lighter rye, and it's not as sour. In Sweden, they have a bread called limpa that has rye flour in it, but it also has a lot of molasses, and you add aniseed and sometimes orange, and so it becomes a quasi-sweet loaf. If you take a fish like herring, which was once ubiquitous, in the Baltic, and in those and in the White Sea, unfortunately now it has been overfished. But in Russia, it would be smoked perhaps or pickled. But the further west you go, it becomes something like glassmaster's herring in Sweden, which has a lot of sugar added to the vinegar. And in Holland, also famous for its herring, the matjes herring also tend to be preserved on the sweet side. Even something like gravlax, so you have a side of salmon and you want to preserve that. In Sweden, they probably use about twice as much sugar in the curing process as they do in Russia. So that was one of the things I wanted to keep tracing, was this, move to ever sweeter taste. But that sort of, disappeared since I wrote a different book.
Actually, I read also Fire and Ice.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't have the printed book. I read it on Google, how it's called, Google Books or Google Play, something like that.
Oh,
yeah.
Send me your address and I'll send you a copy, because it's actually very beautiful. It's the same photographer who did Beyond the North Wind, and the photography is just gorgeous.
Thank you.
Okay.
Speaking of, you were talking a lot about the tradition of fermentation, and a lot of people find fermentation intimidating. But for centuries, people fermented without pH meters, precise temperatures, or formal training. Do you think hands-on teaching is essential for beginners, or can books, blogs, and YouTube be enough to get started?
It's a complicated question because I think it depends a lot on what culture you live in. Part of the fear of fermentation among Americans is that this is such a germ-phobic culture. It's like they're well, obviously with COVID, there are hand sanitizers, but even before that, you know, all the soap was antibacterial. It's like they try and get all bacteria and all microbes out of our environment, and kids are getting sicker and sicker because they're getting asthma now. They're not exposed to any kind of good microbes because everything's supposed to be super so-called hygienic. So I think to overcome that fear, it's really helpful to have someone to hold your hand. If I think about books like Kirsten Schocke's, and I know that she's going to be on this webinar later, her books are fantastic because they really do hold your hand, and she describes things very clearly. And I think that you can definitely learn from those. And it's also really useful to have YouTube these days because you can see things and you can look closely and see what stage the fermentation is at and have a sense of how big the bubbles need to be or something like that. So yes, it is possible to learn. It's not essential to have someone guiding you. However, what's lost is the intimacy of the instruction. Historically, recipes and techniques were passed down usually matrilineally. You know, it was the grandmother teaching the mother teaching the daughter. And you have this sense of continuity and tradition that I think is divorced from when you see someone you don't know doing it on screen. And the thing that is missing most to me, and that is quite relevant when we're talking about fermentation, is the smell. So how do you know if something has fermented to a good point or if it's gone beyond? To me, it's the nose. I mean, you can look at how active the ferment is, but it's really the nose that tells you if it's where you want it to be. That's something that comes only from experience. But if you haven't smelled it for the first time to know what's a good sour smell and what's an off sour smell, that part's really hard to grasp. So I do think people can learn from other sources, but if you can find someone who can actually be there with you as you're making your first ferment, it will be enormously helpful.
Right. Actually, about the nose, you are very right. When I grew koji for the first time, I decided not to use it. Then I grew it a few other times to make sure that, because I had never smelled koji before. And I grew it for a few times to make sure that the smell is consistent. Yeah, so when the smell is consistent, I'm like, okay, then probably that's how it should be. Then I'll try and make something else from it.
Yeah, and it worked, right?
Right, yeah.
But I think some people wouldn't be as experimentally minded, like they'd make it and then feel too insecure or too worried that they get sick from something bad to keep pursuing it.
Right. Once I actually got food poisoning from tempeh that I made.
Okay. Well, but you're still alive to tell us about it.
Yeah, but then I learned the right way, yeah, through trial and error.
Yeah.
And your latest project, Preserved, I think it's a 4-volume series. Can you tell us more about this?
Yeah, it was intended as a 6-volume series. So the first 2 that came out 2 years ago were condiments and fruit. And then this past fall, it was drinks and vegetables. And then the following 2 are dairy and grains. Grains is actually the last one in the series and the one that we're working on now. But what we just decided last month is, instead of publishing the last 2 as these small dedicated volumes like the early ones were, we're going to wait a couple of years and bring out one big compendium in the fall of 2026 that includes the first 4 volumes, slightly tweaked, plus the 2 new ones, so that it's all in one place and has some heft, but still with the same beautiful illustrations and the same cultural material, which to me is always very important. So that's the project.
And can you tell a little bit more about the drinks from this series?
Yeah. So they range all over the world. That's one of the things that has been so wonderful about this, is really going into other cultures and their methods for fermentation and preservation. So there are some old-fashioned American drinks that have fallen out of people's consciousness. Things like switchel, which was an 18th century drink, and the original sarsaparilla sodas that were like the precursor to root beer. And if you ever have had a commercial bottle of root beer, I mean, there's satisfaction to it, but it has nothing to do with the process of gathering all of these very different roots and barks and herbs and allowing them to ferment and then carbonating them so that you have this really effervescent drink. We have Kvass, from the Russian tradition, an aged eggnog that you can make an eggnog base and then use that to have a almost ready-made batch of fresh eggnog whenever you're ready for that. Throughout the winter, instead of having to make it from scratch each time. There's a really awesome fire cider. It's very strong and vinegar based. And we made a homemade Amaro that is still aging in my pantry. So lots and lots of different things.
And grain-based fermentation is a big focus in this webinar. Do you have any favorite grain ferment? And if so, could you share a recipe or talk a little bit how do you like to use it?
Sure. As I mentioned, we're just starting work on this final part of our preserved series. But one recipe I could mention is fermented oatmeal. And the way this started for me was when I was testing recipes for Beyond the North Wind. I wanted to go back, I don't know about in Dubai, but in coffee shops in the United States, everyone asks for Oatly, which is the oat milk made by a Swedish company. And they talk about how they discovered it. And, it's this amazing new thing. But in Russia, they were making oat milk, back in the 9th century. And they would soak the oats, and then the liquid that drained off was the oat milk. And sometimes they would heat it and then allow it to cool. And you could either have a thickened oat milk or something more like a pudding that was called kisiel, from the Russian word for sour. And it was really the food of the peasantry for hundreds and hundreds of years. And so I decided I would make that, but the problem was I just don't love it. And I didn't want to put a recipe in the book that I didn't love. And, I tried tweaking it, making it sweet with honey or jam and berries. And then I tried making it savory, adding rye crumbs and caramelized onions, but it still didn't hit the spot. But I had these oats that I had soaked to make the oat milk. And I decided to try fermenting those. And it was just beautiful. And so basically what you do is you take whole oats, the whole groats, and you soak them overnight in cool water for, I don't know, just soak them for 24 hours and drain off the liquid. And then you take boiled water that you have cooled down and pour that over the oats and let them sit at room temperature for about 48 hours until they ferment. And then you have these fermented oats and you cook them in water for about, actually what you do, sorry, I missed a step. Before you ferment the oats for 24 hours, you take the soaked grains and you put them through a blender or food processor to break them up so that they're more like cracked wheat in smaller pieces, not the whole groats. And then you use those to make the oatmeal and you cook it for only 10 minutes and add milk or water, and it's really delicious. It's funny because after the book came out, I got a message from someone in Malaysia who had wasn't an expert fermenter, and he said, I left my oats to ferment on the counter for 48 hours, and it's really disgusting, and there's all this mold all over them. I said, well, that's because you're in Malaysia. It's a lot hotter there. That's the other thing about knowing or learning from someone about fermenting. In my wintertime kitchen here in a relatively cold part of the world, sometimes I have to put my ferments in the proof the proof setting of my oven, because the room temperature is never warm enough to really jumpstart fermentation. But if you're in a warm place, obviously it happens a lot faster. So that is the fermented oatmeal is one of my go-to recipes.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing that I really like to do is to take malted grains like rye and barley and mix them with some rye flour and buckwheat flour, barley flour. You can use any flour you want, a little bit of water, and cook that in a very, very low stove until it gets very rich smelling, and use that as the base for kvass instead of using stale black bread that you reconstitute, because it just has a much deeper flavor.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm sure as I work on this book, there are going to be some new favorites down the line.
And for you, kisiel, is it a drink or a meal?
Well, for me, it is, I actually like the kisiel that is made from cranberries and other berries. I honestly don't love the one that's made from grain, but I respect it. It's very nourishing, and I understand why it was the mainstay of the Russian diet, the Russian peasant diet, for so many years.
Mm-hmm.
I don't like it when it's really hard. I like it somewhere between a pure liquid and, something that is more yogurt-like in consistency, so it's solid but still has some looseness to it.
Mm-hmm.
Why is it something you like?
I've been experimenting with it recently a lot, and I tried to use fermented oat. Then basically I I was cooking with a lot of water and adding a lot of fruit. So I would get actually like a drink, a very kind of yogurt-like drink, still made with oats, but also with a lot of fruits in it. And because I added a lot of water, it was like it was fluid rather than thick and meal-like. So that I enjoyed.
Yeah, that sounds good. I think it's the fruit that, for me, would elevate it.
And I even infused water with tonka beans overnight, so it had a very interesting flavor.
I bet.
Yeah. And there's been a huge revival of traditional food preservation techniques in recent years. Do you think this is just a trend, or is it something that will stick around in modern kitchens and bars?
I'm never good at predicting trends, but I actually think it's here to stay. Maybe not so much in your face as places that are doing solely fermentation and nothing else. But I think the idea of fermentation will be continue to be increasingly incorporated into bar and restaurant menus, because people now are familiar with the complexity of taste that arises from the fermentation process, and they like it. And I don't think they want to give it up. I think there's definitely a movement towards that more savory kind of flavor, as opposed to if you're thinking about traditional American cocktails like the Cosmopolitan or something like that, that tends to be quite sweet, and they were once very trendy. It has now moved in the other direction. So I don't think it's going to go away.
Right. Yeah, that's, I think, all the questions that I had.
Thank you for having me. And I look forward to meeting in person someday.